Some property market watchers are pointing to what's happening across the ditch in Sydney and making dire predictions about what it means for house owners in Tamaki Makaurau, Auckland. So joining us this morning to take stock of the situation is One Roof property commentator Ashley Church. Tēnā koe, Ashley.
G'day, Jack.
Just maybe we could start with a bit of context. What is actually happening in Sydney?
So interesting to put, as you say, to put context on it. It's this whole process of crash spotting that's been going on for some period of time. In fact, it's not a new thing. It's been going on for the last 2 or 3 cycles. And each time that we get to this period of the cycle, the end of a boom and this flattening period, there's a group of people who look for some opportunity to see something that might be happening in the market that suggests it's going to crash. And so this particular time, it's a bit like spotting the Loch Ness Monster. This time it's about the Sydney market and what's going on over there. So what's happening in the Sydney market is that it followed a similar trajectory to Auckland over the same period of time, but over the last 12 months, in fact in February it dropped by 1.1%, and over the last 12 months it's dropped by 11.5%. And so the crash spotters are looking at that and saying, well, the Sydney market's tanking, so surely that means that Auckland's going to follow in its wake and the same thing's going to happen here. That's essentially what's going on.
But does Auckland actually follow Sydney if we look at things with a slightly wider lens?
Well, that's a really, really good question. So what actually happens is if you take the data going back to 1992 to get a full set of information and you look at Auckland and Sydney and you compare apple for apples, there is actually, to be fair, a remarkable degree of similarity. They actually track quite a similar trajectory. And so if you looked at that, you would say, well, maybe that is an indication that the two are actually coupled up and that Auckland is actually going to follow on from Sydney. But here's the thing. If you look at what's going on in Sydney at the moment, as I said before, it's 11.5% drop. In Auckland, it's just 2.2% drop. And when you look at that data, what we find is that, in fact, Auckland doesn't follow Sydney, it mirrors it. Now, that's a really important distinction because mirrors it means that the two things do roughly the same thing at the same time. And logic suggests to you, Jack, that the reason that that's happening is because they're both actually being influenced by external things going on elsewhere in the world market and other parts of the country. So this idea that Auckland's going to follow Sydney actually isn't borne out by the facts. The fact is that they both generally mirror each other, but right now they're actually doing two quite different things.
But that doesn't mean that Auckland property prices won't continue to cool off a bit.
No, it doesn't. What it does suggest, though, is that something different is going on, given that there is that disparity in the figures and that 2.2% drop in Auckland over the last 12 months. What I think it is if you look at the Sydney market, one of the things that Sydney did was it was further ahead with supply, so it was actually providing more homes in the marketplace than Auckland and indeed New Zealand has been over that same period of time. And I think one of the things that's done is if you increase supply, it takes pressure off demand and therefore prices. I think that's had an impact on Sydney, which you could probably argue in the long run's a positive thing, but it has meant that it's kept that price pressure on in Auckland in a way that it hasn't in Sydney.
If we're to consider these markets in terms of cycles, what typically happens in the Auckland market at the end of a cycle?
So pretty predictable. So we've been through probably 4 of these things now since the early 80s. And each of those cycles, they have prices have roughly doubled and then settled off. And so what then tends to happen, there's a sort of a settling down period, what we call the flattening period. And by flattening, we don't necessarily mean absolutely flat. So to take Auckland as an example, in 1998, after the Asian financial crisis, prices came down at their lowest point by about 6.6%. They stayed there for about a year and then went up again. In 2008, after the GFC, same thing. They came down to about 8.6% off the height of the market, the peak of the market, stayed there for about a year and then took off again. Now, neither of those figures, as I think you'll agree, are crashes. They're simply reflections of an equalisation of the market before that market trend takes off again over a period of time.
Okay, thanks so much for your time, Ashley. Always appreciate it. That is property commentator Ashley Church.
You know, something I love is that everyone complains about how house prices are too high and they're crazy, and then as soon as they come down a little bit, everyone freaks out like the sky is falling. This is a good thing. Yeah.